Welcome everybody to today's Fellows Colloquium. Our speaker, Michael Burawoy, is Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley. His lifelong dream to work in a steel mill in a socialist country was realized in the 1980s when he maintained an 80-ton furnace at Hungary's Lenin Steelworks, along with several other comrades. Indeed, through participant observations, he has studied industrial workplaces around the world, including in Zambia, Chicago, Hungary, and Russia. For 2 decades, he was, to quote the Village Voice, sociology's underground man, scribbling field notes from the factory floor and beaming back dispatches against the global grain, unquote. Having left factory work behind, he now explores his own workplace, the university, to consider the way sociology itself is produced and disseminated to diverse publics. His research interests have included labor, methodology, capitalism on earth, and he engages with Marxism, seeking to reconstruct it in the light of his research concerns and more broadly in the light of historical challenges of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And accordingly, he's examined the nature of postcolonialism, the organization of consent to capitalism, the peculiar forms of working class consciousness and work organization in state socialism, and the dilemmas of transition from socialism to capitalism, all from the perspective of the workplace. He's the author of or co-author of numerous books, the majority of which have quickly become classics in the field. These include Global Ethnography, Forces, Connections, and Imaginations in a Postmodern World, and Manufacturing Consent, Changes in the Labor Process under Monopoly Capitalism. The list of his very recent or forthcoming writings is long and includes Decolonizing Sociology, The Significance of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Return to Fanon. Please welcome Michael Burawoy.
Thank you, Krishna. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you both. Thank you very much, Krishna. You obviously did some work on that biography. Thank you very much. And thank you for emphasizing that I was once an ethnographer, indeed spent a lot of my life as an ethnographer. Anyway, it is a privilege to be amongst such company. You talk about my dream of being in the Lenin Steelworks as a furnaceman. Actually, another of my dreams has been to be amongst people like yourselves, studying race in different parts of the world from different perspectives. And that is why I applied to be a member of this center, and I'm very fortunate to have been accepted. I've already been treated to some wonderful ethnographies. We all have interesting histories. We've only been at it for 2 or 3 months, so this is going to be a wonderful experience for me. But I do feel a bit of an imposter, I guess. I am, as I just said, I'm here to learn from others. I'm inspired by Du Bois, who never stopped learning until his dying days. One of the most remarkable parts of his long life is the way he continually changes his mind and develops new perspectives. So it's very difficult to get a lock on his works, as I'm discovering. I mean, the project of Du Bois, just reading Du Bois when one includes both the published and the unpublished works, is a major task in itself. And then there is an industry of interpretations of Du Bois that every day I learn is bigger and bigger and bigger. So yes, this is an immense task, and that's, I suppose, the title of my talk, Conversations with Du Bois, imaginary ones I might add, is really rather pretentious, and I'm intimidated by the company here, starting from our leader, Dr. Gates. Yeah, it is a foolhardy project I've got, but at this time in my career, I feel I can take on foolhardy projects. And as I've been told very often in the past, fools march in where angels fear to tread. That's me. So what I want to do today is just give you a sketch. I'm not giving you a PowerPoint because a PowerPoint presumes I know what I'm talking about. And I'm not sure that I do. And I look forward to your comments. I see myself having two projects with respect to Du Bois. One is to engage Du Bois with erstwhile sociology and the sociological canon on the one side, and the other project is to engage Du Bois with the Marxist tradition. And I'm going to give you, if time permits, a flavor of both of these projects today. Yeah. Well, let me perhaps say a little bit about Du Bois and sociology. As you perhaps all know, sociology in the United States is a bit backward. It came in touch with Du Bois relatively late. And when I think about my own life, I started out my sociology in Africa, in Zambia, 1968 to 72. And while I was studying there and doing research there, Du Bois' name never appeared. I subsequently, and during that time, studied South Africa, apartheid South Africa, from a Marxist perspective, as was quite current at the time. Again, Du Bois did not appear in the literature. And when I arrived, eventually I arrived in Chicago, the University of Chicago, in the sociology department. The only meaningful course I could find was one given by the one and only William Julius Wilson. He just arrived at the very day that I arrived in 1972. He was giving a course on race, and he was beginning to think about class as well, which is something I had been thinking about quite a lot and written quite a lot about. But what is interesting, in that course, W.E.B. Du Bois did not figure at all. In fact, I was so impressed by one thing, the backwardness of the sociology of race in 1972. And then I began teaching. I got a job at the University of California, Berkeley, to teach, and I was teaching sociology, social theory, and Du Bois did not figure at all. I decided in the middle 90s that it's about time, finally, I think about Du Bois as a social theorist, and I tried to introduce him into my theory course. It's a 2-semester theory course, but decided he didn't quite fit. And of course, as a theorist, he's a very peculiar theorist. He's very much a historian as well as a sociologist. And it's difficult to actually extract theory in the conventional sense of the word from Du Bois. That requires a lot of work. I was not ready to do that in 1994. Instead, I introduced Frantz Fanon's writings, which I had grown up with in Africa. He fit my vision of social theory better than Du Bois. And of course, I was only reading what sociologists were reading at the time, whether it be the Philadelphia Negro or the Souls of Black Folk. It was for a limited perspective on Du Bois. In 2004, I became president of the American Sociological Association, and I decided for the opening plenary, I would have some very distinguished public sociologists. The theme of those meetings, defined by myself, was public sociology. And I thought there's no one to match Du Bois as a public sociologist. And so we had an opening plenary that included figures that we now know, Gerald Horne, Manning Marable, Patricia Hill Collins, and Alden Morris. Sad to say that Manning Marable is no longer with us. It was the most spectacular plenary. You could hear a pin drop as these 4 scholars of Du Bois engaged with his writings. So that was 2004. It took me some time to really start taking Du Bois dead seriously, I'm afraid, until it took 2015, when Alden Morris, I don't know if anybody here knows Alden Morris, but he has become a major figure in the resurrection and redemption of Du Bois, the sociologist, in US sociology. His book, The Scholar Denied, has been very widely reviewed and read. And this year he was president of the American Sociological Association and focused those meetings on Du Bois. Now, The Scholar Denied, he presented it. I invited him to present it at Berkeley. And it is a wonderful book which focuses on Du Bois, his early writings, the Philadelphia Negro, Farmville, and the Atlanta School, and which is the school he basically ran, organized, and largely founded in Atlanta when he was at Atlanta University. Which probably, well, he leaves Atlanta University in 1910, so the school continues a little bit, but the main years are while he was actually there. Now, Alden's idea is that Du Bois was the real founder of US sociology. And I think he makes a very powerful case for that being true. And he compares it with the stereotypical founders of American sociology, Chicago School, and its leader, Robert Park. And Alden shows that actually, you know, that the empirical work as a sociologist done by Du Bois and his colleagues was antedated the Chicago School by 20 years. I think it's incontrovertible that he was the founder of US sociology. Perhaps not recognized as such until now. Alden writes the book. But, you know, it's not so great to be the founder of American sociology. It's a pretty parochial discipline. And has to be fed in later on by European social theorists, Weber and Durkheim and Marx, but they come in rather later. But all I want to suggest is that, yes, that it may be true that what Alden is saying is that, you know, the Du Bois is the founder of US sociology, but that is an insult almost to Du Bois. To pair him off with Robert Park, who reads Robert Park today? He's an insignificant figure in sociology. You know, it's no great achievement to be greater intellect, in my view, than Robert Park. So I think the real question when we want to bring Du Bois into sociology is to actually engage him with a discussion of our canonical figures, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And that has been my project for the last 3 or 4 years, to develop conversations between Marx, Weber, and Durkheim on the one side and Du Bois on the other. It's a difficult project because Du Bois's writings weave themselves in and out. He returns to themes that he'd elaborated before and then re-elaborates and reconstructs them. But what I've come to the conclusion, temporary, conjectural conclusion, is that we can think about 3 conversations. One is between the early writings of Du Bois, and here I'm thinking particularly of the Philadelphia Negro, the Atlanta School, and the Souls of Black Folk, 1903, and possibly also his PhD dissertation, The Suppression of Slavery in the United States, slave trade, I should say, in the United States. And here, this is Du Bois as a Durkheimian, particularly clear in the Philadelphia Negro, where what do we see? We see a wonderful analysis of the life in the 7th Ward, given a historical context. But the theoretical framework is very undeveloped. It's a methodologically very sophisticated or very intensely pursued, but theoretically relatively limited. And if one puts the theory together, it looks very much like Durkheim's division of labor, particularly the abnormal forms of the division of labor. And what Du Bois is saying is that emancipation from slavery led to migration from the South to Philadelphia. Of course, there were African Americans there before, but he's talking about the migration to northwards after emancipation. And this leads to a state of anomie. That's the Durkheimian expression. And the other sort of abnormal form of division of labor is the forced division of labor that Durkheim talks about, that is manifested in the discrimination that African Americans face in the 7th Ward in Philadelphia, in the North more broadly. But I think this is the more reformist Du Bois. I don't think there's doubt about that. The idea here is that, if only we can accumulate knowledge, then that knowledge becomes power, and power will mean the progressive reforms, inclusion of African Americans. He believed in the power of sociological knowledge, which of course he picked up not so much from the US, but he picked up from his 2 years, 1892-94 in Germany, University of Berlin. All right, so if we look at the souls of Black folk, I think one can say the same sorts of pathologies described in the Philadelphia Negro, and a very powerful concern with education. I'll have more to say about souls of Black folk later, but here I just want to emphasize the focus on education, which is another way in which Du Bois and Durkheim converge. And they're both concerned with the reformulation of the collective consciousness, another Durkheimian idea. All right, let me move on. Let me move on to the next phase, which I call the anti-Weber Du Bois. I start that with John Brown, 1909, that book that Du Bois thought was a really great book. I don't know if it's such a great book, but it's a very interesting book in that now Du Bois is talking about insurgency from below. What does he say? The mantra that runs through that book is the mantra, the price of liberty is less than the cost of repression. Yes, emancipation involves struggles and loss of life, but it is a loss of life that is much less than the cumulative impact of the racial order of slavery and post-slavery. So he's indicating there a very different idea, namely the importance of insurgency from below. And of course, John Brown was the leader of the insurrection in Harper's Ferry, which was a sort of dress rehearsal in 1859 for the Civil War. So yeah, then we go on. I love these essays. The essays in Darkwater is my favorite book. And I could just talk for hours about those essays, but I want to suggest here that, again, it's an anti-Weber story. Weber's very famous for talking about the origins of capitalism and the role of the Protestant ethic, and plays down the significance of violence and the importance of violence in keeping capitalism going. And Du Bois is very opposed to that vision, because in The Souls of White Folk, that very famous essay, the opening essay, I believe, in Darkwater, he argues that yes, Western civilization is superior, but why is it superior? It is superior because it has taken so much from the rest of the world through force of arms. So yeah, so there's a very interesting debate there. And what Weber says is he doesn't talk so much about the violence of appropriation. He talks about the systematization of inventions, recognizes that of inventions, developments in different parts of the world, their systematization, their rationalization, the rise of rationalism. That is what distinguishes the West. Very different from the Du Boisian idea of imperialism as the significance of the West. And then there are all these beautiful essays. I mean, then there's the Work and Wealth essay, which is about the race riot in East St. Louis in 1917, a beautiful class race analysis, the three actors being white capital, Black labor, migrant labor from the South, and white labor from Europe. And suggests actually that there could be, or there were tendencies towards some sort of interracial solidarity in the working class, but it broke down as a result of the ways in which white working class and white capital forged an alliance, which of course he will write about later on. Anyway, what's interesting about that essay is not just the analysis, but actually the concluding part where he talks about socialism is the answer. Levering Lewis, when he writes his biography, he hasn't got much to say about the socialism that ends so many of the essays in Darkwater. The idea that, yes, this is the future. But he says, this is only the future if we first solve the race problem. We cannot postpone the race problem, as the socialists were not taking it seriously enough, the socialists of the time. He wants to emphasize, yes, the United States can be redeemed, but first we got to solve the race problem, and only then socialism. Yeah. Well, there are wonderful essays in that book. There's also the famous essay of Damnation of Women that puts him into some sort of dialogue with feminism in a very complicated way, a very interesting way. Anyway, that's the anti-Weber. So that basically Weber doesn't believe in socialism at all. The problem is bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is going to bureaucratize the very possibility of a world after capitalism. You know, what we will not have is a dictatorship of the proletariat, but the dictatorship of officials. Yeah, Du Bois is saying, no, that's not the problem. The problem is the race problem. Yeah. All right. That's anti-Weber. I'm obviously just giving you a glimpse of the sorts of arguments I would like to make. Then we move on to the Marx. Now, this is very weird. To figure out, and I can't do it, perhaps Dr. Gates can help us. I've been reading many articles as to where he gets his Marx from. He's already a socialist, a utopian socialist in 1920. And of course, he's been going to the meetings of the Social Democratic Party in 1892-94 when he's in Berlin. But he claims that he never read Marx until 1928-29. And he's complaining that his educators at the great institution known as Harvard never even mentioned the word Marx. Of course, it must have been mentioned by, some of his teachers like Schmoller in Germany, but he claims that he never really took Marx very seriously. And of course, Marxism was in the air, particularly in the world that he patronized, the world in which he circulated. As soon as actually he left academia in 1910 and became the editor of Crisis and the formation of NAACP. So he's mixing with socialists of the time, but his language, sometimes he's almost quoting word for word from Marx, but no reference to Marx. It's a strange relationship. But anyway, my concern is that he really becomes a Marxist with the writings of Black Reconstruction. And this is an extraordinary book. For so long, sociologists never even read it. Historians, another story altogether. It is a most extraordinary book. I think and many people agree, is magnum opus. And there, the whole vocabulary is Marxian, the framework is Marxian. You remember, well, I don't know if I'm not sure what I can assume about people's knowledge of Du Bois, but that book begins with a chapter on the black worker, the white worker, the planter. There's a class analysis of race. Class analysis of race. And he talks about general strike in the most provocative chapter in the book, where Marx is saying, how can slaves engage in a strike? Well, he's really trying to emphasize, of course, that slaves are workers too. Black slaves are workers too. And of course, what the argument is that without the revolt of the slaves, the exodus of 200,000 slaves from the plantations, without that exodus, the Civil War would not be won by the North. That in fact, the so-called general strike, the fugitive slaves, became the crucible, became the crucial element, the pivotal element in the victory of the North. So yes, and then of course there is the analysis of Reconstruction, and I'll say in a few minutes a bit more about that, but what is so interesting about that is what is often ignored in the book is the 3 chapters in the middle, where he talks about how Reconstruction that lasts for 10 or 11 years after the end of the Civil War actually looks very different in different states in the South. And he talks off with South Carolina, where the possibilities were, in his view, the greatest and moved the furthest in terms of some sort of interracial democracy, compares it with Mississippi and Louisiana, and then talks about Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, where the chances were very slim, and finally talked about the frontier states. But in each of those 4 sets of states, the analysis is of a relationship between race and class, trying to figure out what are the possibilities of an interracial democracy. And then, of course, the North pulls out after the election of 1876, resolved in 1877, and the North pulls out, and there's a term, as he says, back to slavery. His famous account is summarized succinctly in the rise of the public and psychological the wages of whiteness. White workers lose an interest in forging any solidarity with blacks. And we have the rise of Jim Crow. Yeah, but this is very much a Marxist analysis. And we can move on, and I would suggest to you that actually if we move on to something like, I don't know, The World in Africa is in 1947, is already a very different sort of Marxism. He's lost sight, as I will emphasize in a few minutes, he's lost sight of the class analysis, and he's interested in more in the imperial analysis, in which the nation state is a unity and the world is made up of nation states in some hierarchy of subjugation. Of course, The World in Africa also, like the book 1915, Negro, and then the Black Folk, then and now in 1938, I think he wrote that. I mean, it's a succession of books that are trying to establish the character, from his point of view, the character and complexity of Africa itself before, during, and after colonialism. Yeah. So and then of course as some of you may know, that he gets very much involved in the peace movement. He becomes the chair of the Peace Information Center, and he's indicted, in this time, he is not somebody to sort of to change his views because of political circumstances. He sticks his neck out, insists that he is concerned with the question of peace, which puts him on the wrong side of the Cold War as far as the US is concerned. He's indicted as a foreign agent, an unregistered foreign agent. There is a trial, it's basically thrown out. But it brings to him even more popularity outside the United States, less popularity amongst his middle class colleagues in the United States. But he's also in the 1950s building up close relations with young civil rights workers in the South, a story that is well described, in my view, by Gerald Horne and others. But his passport is appropriated. He's stuck in the United States, and as he remarries Shirley Graham, and she sort of transmits, brings him into a circle of communists, white and black. Paul Robeson, for example, is prominent among them, and I think his vision becomes, more leftist, not necessarily more Marxist, as I will suggest in a minute. But anyway, in 58, he gets his passport. He goes on sort of almost like a victory tour of many countries, but particularly Soviet Union and China, and is very much enamored by what he sees there, and begins to identify with these two huge countries. So the contrast between the sort of the celebration of his life in those countries, with the way he has been marginalized, oppressed in the United States, is very deep. And he decides to give up on the United States in 1961, becomes a member of the Communist Party that he had always resisted doing before, and moves off with his friend Kwame Nkrumah in 1961, and dies in 1963 in Ghana. Anyway, the point is that I think one can conduct these conversations between these Marx, Weber, and Durkheim on the one side and Du Bois on the other. Now, behind all this is something I don't want to talk about now, but you can ask me in questions. There's a vision of what the canon is all about. My view, and in sociology, we're very weird people. The canon in sociology is made up of these, at this moment in time, these three figures, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and they are foundational in the sense that they establish research programs through which sociological knowledge develops. But the point is that the canon is made of these figures that are foundational. But, you know, in the old days when Talcott Parsons, this Harvard eminence, Greece, I mean, he invented a canon in the early 1950s, which was the convergence of theorists. And they were going all converging in his big grand theory of structural functionalism that bit the dust very quickly in the early 60s with the rise of social movements. And in comes Marx as a new member of the canon. The canon changes, and the canon actually is not made up of a convergent set of theorists, but of disparate, engaged theorists with one another, conversations like the one I'm conducting today, or at least that is my view. So the canon is foundational, it's relational, you don't just add theorists, and it's dynamic. And that is the significance of Du Bois, therefore, is to bring him in with a conversation. And I believe that there will be a transformation. If we take this project seriously, this might be the end of one or more of these canonical figures, because I think Du Bois today represents things very much out of whack with many of the claims and visions of the Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. But we do this by developing a conversation. All right. What I really want to just say something about, because I suspect none of you, or very few of you, are interested in sociology. I want to tell you about, I walk on two legs. The other leg is the Marxist leg. The Marxist leg, you know, it's interesting how people appropriate Du Bois. Everybody is so complex, and there's so much, everybody has their own Du Bois. I don't know if Dr. Gates is going to declare his Du Bois very clearly. I mean, you write this beautiful introduction to all the series, but I believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I read in the newspaper that you're writing a biography of Du Bois, a very daunting task. And so, you know, you're going to have to decide what is your Du Bois, I suppose. But anyway, the point is everybody has their Du Bois. And I was listening to Tommy Shelby, who's a philosopher here in Harvard. He calls himself, and he says that Du Bois is an analytical Marxist. I mean, he said he was going to be here today, but he couldn't make it. But I was going to have an argument with him. Du Bois is not an analytical Marxist, but of course Shelby, because he's a philosopher, and you know, basically it's analytical philosophy. And if you're going to appropriate Du Bois, it's got to be the analytical Du Bois. But no. You know, Du Bois is so rooted in history and experience, the very antithesis of analytical Marxism. And then we have Manning Marable, who says he's a Western Marxist. Well, Western Marxist because he was not so closely connected to the revolution. I don't know. I can't go along with that one either. I was reading recently Rieland Rabaka's latest book on Du Bois, and he says he's an Afro-American Marxist. And that's getting nearer, I think. And what is most interesting, what has spurred so much of the debate is Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. It's a weird book in my view, very fascinating book. But you know what he claims is that you know his characters that are significant for him are Richard Wright, C.L.R. James, and Du Bois, and he basically argues that they shift from Marxism to this Black African tradition. I don't see it. I mean, Du Bois and C.R. James never leave Marxism really. So I'm wondering where he gets that idea, but I'm going to appropriate the idea of Black Marxism. I think this word black has to be interrogated, but it's probably not for me to do that now at any rate. And what my view of that, if I had, you know, if I have time here in Cambridge, I would like to put together well, I'm not going to be able to do this, but my dream would be to put together a tradition that goes Du Bois, Fanon, C.R. James, Stuart Hall. And I know Jim is a Stuart Hall professor here, so, and Stuart Hall, of course, has played an important role here in the Du Bois Center. Anyway, so that's an interesting group of people to see a tradition build up. So what I want to do today is just give you a little glimpse of Fanon, because you know Fanon and Du Bois, that's a very interesting conversation, fascinating, and I think Cillian will have lots of things to say to me about this because I'm going to sort of simplify Fanon. what is so interesting about the comparison is that, on the one hand, we have, the famous two books. There are four books of Fanon, but basically two books, Black Skin, White Masks on the one hand, and Wretched of the Earth on the other. And the parallels I want to draw in Du Bois are Souls of Black Folk on the one side and Black Reconstruction on the other. And I'm particularly interested in the comparison between Black Reconstruction and the Wretched of the Earth. But let me start with the first one, namely Souls of Black Folk and Black Skin, White Masks. On the face of it, very similar. There's a sort of social psychology of subjugation, of racial subjugation. And you might say that both are concerned with the internalization of oppression in their different ways. Of course, Du Bois is writing in 1903, the height of Jim Crow, and Fanon is writing in 1951-52 when he has arrived in France to observe Martinican immigrants who are shocked. They are shocked that they are not French, they are Black. That is the basic account of Black Skin, White Masks. And the story, and then the account in that book is precisely of the response of Martinicans to the realities of racial domination, how their attempts to become French, to become actually white, are futile in the face of racism. Now, of course, Du Bois is very clear, as African Americans are very clear, that they are actually, they have no imagination of them being, racially equal. The Martinicans think they're French. Selena has already talked about that in her account of Afrofeminists in France. For African Americans, in 1903, have no illusions that somehow they are sort of part of a national consciousness. No. And so Du Bois talks about double consciousness, yes, he talks about the veil, and there is a world, a segregated world in which African Americans play out their subjugation. And of course, so much of the Souls of Black Folk is precisely about that. But they're different. They're different because the context, first and foremost, is different. And also, it's not only that we're talking about, on the one hand, France in the 1950s dealing with immigrants from Martinique or from West Indies, and in the case of Du Bois, we're dealing with Jim Crow in the South. It's not only that, but actually, Fanon is really talking about a bourgeoisie. These are professionals, very often, that he describes in Black Skin, White Mask, whereas Du Bois has already a stratification, four-class stratification of African Americans. So their conceptualization of the Black world is quite different. It's interesting, it's a digression, footnote. Du Bois, Fanon writes a wonderful essay on the veil in his life. And for him, the veil, as it becomes a big debate, he sees the veil, the wearing of the veil, women wearing the veil, as an anti-colonial maneuver. Because of course the colonists want to get, particularly the French ones, they want to get rid of the veil. They want to introduce modernity. And so resistance is seen to be the veil. And of course, not only that, if you've seen the Battle of Algiers, that wonderful film, you see that one of the strategies of the colonized against the colonial regime in Algeria was for women to wear the veil and actually veil all the sorts of things that they were doing as part of the anti-colonial struggle. Yeah. It's a very different thinking about the veil than Du Bois. He hasn't got quite that sort of militant, radical, resistive moment, but at least, we are seeing something richer within the veil than Fanon talks about when he's writing about Black Skin, White Masks. Yeah. All right. Anyway, the point is that, yes, we can say a lot about the parallels and differences between these two, but I want to say in my last few minutes, I just want to say something about Black Reconstruction and Wretched of the Earth. Better look at my notes. how do I introduce this? Is a little bit more complicated. Let me give you an intuition, of why I think they're so interestingly parallel, because we can't have a conversation between two theorists unless we introduce some sort of common language through which they can have a discourse, some commonalities. So what is it? So, you know, if we look, as I've already described, Black Reconstruction is a story of a sort of an abolitionist movement. An abolitionist movement against slavery eventually involves a war, so it's violent. It involves then the period of Reconstruction, and then it's post-Reconstruction, sort of the denouement of that's what I think Du Bois calls a splendid failure at one point. And of course, that is very similar to the periodization that Fanon gives in The Wretched of the Earth, the anti-colonial movement, which he sees as a violent movement. The only way to expurgate the violence of colonialism is through an anti-colonial but violent movement. And we could talk a lot about violence. And of course, violence has already crept into our discussions this semester, particularly with Aurora's talk of Colombia and the massacre she talked about. But Ma was also, in her accounts, violence is quite a present. And the question is whether, that's where I get back from my colleagues who are who sort of think of Du Bois more as a part of this radical Black tradition, that his understanding and Fanon's understanding of subjugation is not within the Marxian orbit. And that's where there might be a departure. But anyway, I'm still sticking with my Marxist story here, this Marxist comparison. But the point is that, so Fanon, anti-colonial movement, then there is the post-colonial context. And what is interesting for Fanon, that post-colonial context involves a struggle, a class struggle within the colonized. Within the colonized, there are two roads out of colonialism, a bourgeois road, and for Fanon, a national liberation struggle leading to socialism. There are two roads, and which road it will be is determined by, well, what Antonio Gramsci would call a war of position. Basically, who's going to be hegemonic? Which class? Is it going to be the Black national bourgeoisie, or is it going to be the militant radical peasantry led by intellectuals from the urban? And what is so fascinating to me is Du Bois is doing exactly the same sort of project when he talks about Reconstruction, and when he divides up the Reconstruction states into four groups, where the relationship between class and race, and the relationship between class, race, and the state, the local state, is different and divergent. So it's a very, very similar project. But of course, you know, the splendid failure comes to an end, and the possibilities of interracial democracy come to an end. And Du Bois, writing, of course, in 1935, he is able to see, you know, the sorts of forces that conspired the revolt of capital, as he says, of property in the North. The forces that conspire to re-establish the sort of planter hegemony, planter domination in the South. He sees all that. Now, and he has put that in a global context too, which he always does when he talks about Black Reconstruction. But Fanon can't, he dies in 1961. So this is very early in the independence movements in Africa. So Fanon really doesn't see, he sees these two roads. He sees that if you take the bourgeois road, bourgeois democracy established in post-independence Africa will quickly degenerate into a one-party dictatorship and then one-man dictatorship. He anticipates the route of Africa. And so he says in 1961 in The Wretched of the Earth, there's only one road forward for emancipation, for freedom, and that is the socialist road. It's the only way we can go forward. That will involve the transformation of the class structure, whereas the bourgeois road is just changing the color of the incumbents of the pre-existing colonial structure. But of course, Fanon thought, and this is amazing, Fanon understood there was international capitalism, it might be a problem, but he thought that South Africa was so important for Western capital that Africa would have bargaining power, would demand reparations, and they would get them. So he had a very optimistic view about capitalism, which never occurred to Du Bois, who became over his life ever more cynical and pessimistic about the potentialities of capitalism. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. The other thing that Du Bois has over Fanon is that Du Bois recognizes there are multiple roads. There are multiple possibilities of moving towards some interracial democracy, whereas Fanon just had these two. Du Bois had a much richer historical account. And of course, Fanon was actually riveted to Algeria, and his model sounds general, but if you look at other countries in Africa, the class analysis he makes based on Algeria doesn't really work for a country like South Africa, with its very powerful working class. So anyway, there are real problems, I think, with Fanon's analysis, and I'm going to end with the problems of Du Bois's analysis, which I find very, very interesting. Du Bois's analysis, particularly, yeah, of the struggles against the colonialism after Second World War. You know, Du Bois tends to see other nations through the eyes of its leaders. If I look at The World in Africa, Color and Democracy, his writings on independent Africa, though again, of course, he dies in 1963, so it's a sort of limited time period, but nevertheless, if you look at him, he's always looking at the leadership. He's really campaigning, he's campaigning for independence, but he does not see what Fanon sees, namely the importance of class. You are always seeing these entities, these national entities, as homogeneous. In Africa, that is to say, of course, not in the United States, but in Africa, homogeneous. And if you go back to his earlier studies, go back to when he first goes to Africa, and of course, he doesn't go very often, but when he first goes to Liberia in 1923. Liberia, of course, run by African Americans. He doesn't see that this is a colonial project. He doesn't really examine the indigenous population at all, and it is subjugated. And in fact, he campaigns for Firestone Tire Company to be the multinational that should come in and advance the progress of Liberia. He's not got that internal class analysis. And then Anahid Al-Harden, who's a sociologist in American University in Beirut, she has a wonderful essay about Fanon's view of Israel, and Du Bois's view of Israel. Du Bois endorses Israel. He doesn't really think about Palestinians. I mean, he changes his mind later in the Suez Canal business, and when he sees exactly the alliances the Israeli state is making, but his instinct immediately is to identify with the dominant group. And of course, these are people who have suffered the Holocaust. So there's an immediate identification with the leaders. And one might extend this to China and Russia. You know, he visits China and Russia, is very much taken in. There are good reasons why he should be taken in. There are even reasons why he might try and be an apologist for the repression in China and Russia and Soviet Union. But I think there's something else going on here. This identification with the leadership. If the leadership is okay, then the society must be moving forward. And he doesn't apply that to the United States, but he seems to apply that to other countries. And if I may, and on a curious biographical note to do with Du Bois, that he was always interested in those big men who will make history. You know, whether it's Wendell Phillips, the abolitionist, whether it's Bismarck in Germany, whether it's John Brown, the insurgent, And I have one other. Who was my other one? Oops. Yeah, how could I forget? Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. These are the people he puts on a pedestal one way or another, fascinated by the power of leaders. So this is so weird that on the one hand, he has this brilliant class, race, state analysis of Black Reconstruction. And yet when he comes to other countries, he sees it through the lens of the leadership, does not see the struggles of the subjugated. So I must ask why this might be the case. And of course, yeah, I'm sure Jim may have all sorts of views about all this too. But let me suggest there are three possibilities. And then I'll finish. First of all, Du Bois couldn't really get access to Africa. He wanted to go to South Africa. He wrote all sorts of essays in Farley that showed just how superficial his understanding of the history of South Africa was. They would not let him in. I mean, this is apartheid world, right? So one of the problems that Du Bois faced is, he never really visited. He never did that sort of experiential engagement with the world he was talking about. Another is that he was in the United States, and being in the United States, saw the United States as an imperial country, and progress meant being sort of released from, emancipated from that imperial grip. So fighting for the independence of countries was a very important project for him. And the third possible way of thinking about this is he always had a bit of a romance about Africa and trying to sort of recover pre-colonial, colonial Africa, and to show that, yes, these were great civilizations. And in doing so, perhaps that sort of shaped, actually Apaya's got interesting things to say about this. That shaped his way of thinking about post-colonial Africa. But anyway, it's an interesting puzzle that, making the comparison with Fanon, reveals the way he didn't quite understand the post-colonial struggles that would take place in Africa. And he's not really being true, in my view, to his brilliant analysis in Black Reconstruction. But this is a puzzle. And one of the great things about great theorists is they have great contradictions. And I think Du Bois is full of great contradictions, which makes him such a great social theorist. Thank you very much.
Marvelous. Oh my God. That was like fabulous, man. Just so riveting. I know we have a lot of questions and comments, if I may. First off, I'm not writing a biography.
Oh.
No, the books in my new series are very much in the fashioned after the Modern Masters series edited by Frank Kermode. So they're think pieces. No biography allowed. You just line up a person's writings and you write about that. So, and after David Levering Lewis won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for that biography, there's no room to go. So we're not doing biographies.
Excuse me, but are you writing one yourself though?
Yeah, I'm writing a think piece on Du Bois. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
One of the things, I just have a couple notes and then I have one substantial point, but I'm going to study your lecture. I learned so much. You made me think of things that I hadn't thought of. To answer your question, I've written about Du Bois before, but I'm going to write about it from where I stand in the disciplinary realm, which is as a literary critic. I'm very interested in his keywords. I was thinking the keyword approach that Raymond Williams developed would work marvelously for Du Bois because he used the same words in completely different ways. I mean, to connote different concepts over an intellectual career that goes from 1896 in print, even before, counting his journalism in Black newspapers, till his death in 1963. But that's just one way. And his use of metaphor. The great thing about Du Bois is that And the reason that we read him, regardless of whether he was right or wrong, quote unquote, is because he was a master of the act of language crafting. He was a master of metaphor. You know, it was he who coined the veil, and he didn't invent the concept of double conscience, but he appropriated it and applied it to with dazzling genius to the situation of the American Negro in the souls of Black folk. A quick thing on Israel and Liberia. Of course, he had to support Liberia because, I mean, he had to support Israel because he had a fantasy of nativity, you know, the return. There had to be a place where people could go back to that would actually work. And this was going to be the grand experiment with the diaspora being retrieved, you know, being gathered together. And that's why, too, I think he couldn't see Liberia, African Americans, as the oppressor class, because his whole notion of Pan-Africanism would have fallen apart. So he couldn't even see it. I mean, it was impossible. It was almost as if he had sunglasses on that filtered out all the indigenous Liberians, you know, that, and nobody was taking him around showing him the houses that indigenous Liberians were living in. You could count on that. The other thing to remember, this is a small thing, and very few people are aware of this, but when Du Bois made two changes only to the Souls of Black Folk, the Souls of Black Folk's been reprinted over 120 times. And the only textual changes he made had to do with criticism of being anti-Semitic. And he made these changes right when he's writing about Israel. He made them in the 50th anniversary edition, which came out in 1953, right? So, and I have an essay about this, but if you look at the Library of American edition, I found those changes because Nathan Huggins had done an edition and said, like everybody else, there were no changes. And if you're a literary critic, we were taught, now you can do it by computer, but we were taught you get two people to read the thing aloud to each other. This was the tried and true way to note textual changes. And he actually made three. One, he just changed in 1909. He dropped the name of historically Black college. But the two relevant here, he had used in the first edition the phrase "the Jew." And Rabbi so-and-so wrote to him and said, you know, you're an anti-Semite. And he was embarrassed and he apologized in that 50th edition, and he changed it to the immigrant and to something else. He euphemized it, but he let that phrase, the Jew, stand for 50 years. So that's something to think about in relationship to the formation of the state of Israel, both those things, both nativity, the ideal of nativity, the idea that you can go back somewhere, that the diaspora can be reversed or transmuted or transformed, and also his own wrestling with his own anti-Semitism. And I think that that's very important. My question is that you didn't, curiously enough, for a sociologist, you didn't spend much time on his great work of sociology, which is the Philadelphia Negro. Now, you mentioned, but what's interesting is that off the top of my head, and Larry Bobo made me read the Philadelphia Negro. I fully confess, as a literary critic, I looked at that book and I thought, who gives a hoot about the Philadelphia Black community in 1899? And I never read it till 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, when Bobo and I were team teaching Introduction to African American Studies. And what's interesting is that he is the first person that I know of who broke down the class structure within the African American community. Now, one other thing. Of course, he was addicted to the great man theory of history because he was a great man. I mean, the talented 10th was the great man theory of history, and he was the greatest of the great men. So he was Stalin and Lenin and Nkrumah, and you know, he was the Negro. Du Bois, the Dusk of Dawn, or which one is called the subtitle is Autobiography of a Race Concept. He was the race. Yeah. He was not short on ego. There's no question about that. But what's interesting about the Philadelphia Negro is that he says there are 5 classes within the African-American community. And he's very hard on those the lower classes, by his...
The submerged 10th. The submerged
yes,
10th.
The submerged 10th, which becomes the talented. I mean, it's the flip side of the talented 10th, as I say in my lecture. And David Levering Lewis taught me something. He and Deb Willis did an edition of Du Bois's photographs for the Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition of 1900. And he said something that was so stunning, I almost fell over it, which is a real epiphany. Du Bois actually, just to remind people, Reconstruction comes to an end because the 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, starting with Mississippi in 1890, have new state constitutional conventions, and without mentioning the word Negro or race, they disenfranchise all Black men in the South over the next 10 years, right? And they do it through grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, et cetera. Du Bois actually doesn't think that those things are a bad idea initially, because he thought that the great unwashed among the Negro people, maybe they shouldn't have the right to vote either, that it should be class-based. And he even writes about that. And David Levering Lewis makes me realize that there is this little window when the talented 10th is trying to figure out, just as voter suppression is occurring, where if they're class privilege, their class position will be preserved as Jim Crow segregation, as the great curtain as the color line comes, abruptly coming down, as the color line descends. And it is only in those first 4 or 5 years of the 20th century, that they realize that their class status within the race is not that all Black people are the N-word as far as Vardaman is concerned. And all these other segregationists are not going to cut Booker T. Washington any slack, Du Bois any slack. They're not going to make any exceptions, even for the talented 10th. And that radicalizes him in a way he wasn't radicalized when he published The Souls of Black Folk. 2 years later, he forms the Niagara Movement with my grandmother's uncle, J.R. Clifford. And then that morphs into the NAACP. But that little period of the demise of Reconstruction and its practical manifestations on individuals like him takes away any glimmer of hope that there will be exceptions. And he changes his political attitude, because he realizes that those 5 classes that he had enumerated in the Philadelphia Negro have become one class, Negro. If the law says all Negroes shall or all Negroes shan't, there's no room for the submerged 10th and the talented 10th are all the same vis-a-vis the law. And I find that very, very fascinating, and wonder what you do with that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, many things you said, but the Philadelphia, let me first say why I don't talk much about the Philadelphia Negro, because sociologists don't stop talking about the Philadelphia Negro, and they don't see all its problems, and more important, they don't see the rest of Du Bois's life. I mean, that's my mission, is to say Du Bois wrote a hell of a lot more than the Philadelphia Negro and its contributions, and important contributions to the Atlanta School and the Souls of Black Folk. I mean, there's much more to it. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, parallel to what you just said, in the Philadelphia Negro, he does talk about the limiting of franchise, and he wants to do it on educational grounds. But then if you read Darkwater 1920 of the rule of men, oh no, franchise, franchise qualifications has gone out the window. And now we talk about everybody can contribute to a democracy based on their lived experience. And everybody has different lived experiences. So he's radicalized his idea of democracy along the lines that you are
yeah,
suggesting.
because the racists took away, if you're black and had a PhD from Harvard, you were the same as a submerged
Yeah.
10th.
Yeah, but he's still recognizing that there are different lived experiences even amongst African Americans, and of course, gender is one of the dividing grounds. So
listen,
he continues to have
Du Bois remained a classicist. There's no question about that.
Right.
If you look at his writings about jazz, even, and Du Bois and Alain Locke were no fans of jazz in the Harlem Renaissance, and depictions of, if you read the Criterion of Negro Art and his review of Home to Harlem, oh my God! And then when Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes did their own magazine called Fire, his review says, "I have had the pleasure of tossing my copy of Fire into the fire." Right. He was also homophobic.
Well, yeah, Dwight was about to talk about that, but he didn't have enough time. But that's the complicated relationship that Du Bois had to the Harlem Renaissance. But I know that Tanya's eager to engage.
Just all of this. And I actually do have a question, and I'm so excited about this. It's not even funny. Okay, so I'm coming back to Du Bois from Latin America, right? And I just think he, in such an interesting way, represents all of the contradictions that Black US Americans wrestle with in terms of thinking about Black US American radicalism, all of it, the classism, the fact that he would probably have totally played with the US American imperialist project if he could have been included in it and not look back. There's a student at UMass Amherst, a Brazilian doctoral student who's doing very interesting doctoral work on looking at WB in Brazil and how he actually worked with Gilberto Freire, who is the father of, he created he sort of gives the term racial democracy, but really brings together in this way all of these currents that were already existing. And basically, I don't know, in a way in his work codifies the Brazilian racist system. And WEB is working with this guy because he's invested in showing that there's nothing wrong with miscegenation, that miscegenation will not result in creating these sort of mules, right? But he's working with this profoundly racist white mestizo Brazilian who in his work is advocating for why the senzala, like that the Black women that were raped on the plantation, it actually was just this love that the plantation was actually this big happy family with all these kinds of divisions in it. That's the Cliff Notes version. But to me, if I think about the work of people like Ifeoma Nwankwo, in her book Black Cosmopolitanism, she goes farther back, but kind of looks at the tensions again of Black US Americans in terms of how to think about the Haitian Revolution and what impact that means for Black US American radicalism. She looks at Frederick Douglass, for example, and is thinking about, she talks about the debates of whether or not there was a sector that were just like, yeah, we're down with Haiti. And then there's this other sector who would be kind of the precursor to Du Bois that are just kind of like, we need to integrate ourselves even more into this US American project. So anyway, like listen to this conversation, I'm thinking a lot about Black US American exceptionalism, but I'm also thinking about how to think about him. And again, I'm reading Black Reconstruction now, and I was actually planning to read a couple more texts when I come there in the spring because, and this kind of gets to the question, as someone who very much sees themselves as a sociologist, but I'm very much in the closet about it. So in the sense that for the very reasons that you stated in the beginning. And so one of the reasons why I actually wanted to come back to Du Bois was to actually look at him in order to think about how to position my work within sociology. And I'm interested in thinking about how he literally does sociology. And that's actually kind of the question that I have is just, do you have any thoughts or like, what are your thoughts on how to think about how he does sociology and what makes him a sociologist? Because myself and many others, we're not embraced by the discipline, and I refuse to just kind of give in. So I do very much consider myself a sociologist, but I kind of very much feel like I'm a sociologist in exile. But in just circling back to him, and maybe at some other point, I would love to just have a conversation with you to think about a different aspect of his work in terms of thinking about the question of colonialism, particularly the way in which, if you think about Walter Magnolo's work, the way that he positions the Americas, many of the American countries in this hemisphere as post-independence nations, and how like Du Bois's perception is going to be different than Fanon's in terms of the situation that each are in terms of being actually still a colony who goes through this kind of post-colonial experience, in the sense that concepts about the nation state, ideas about race, like all of these things are already sort of formalized and thought and are things by the time you get to the progression of the African continent in terms of colonization. But in the Americas, the United States, Cuba, all of these countries are very influential in terms of everyone, including enslaved people, are involved in the process of imagining and fighting for and creating this thing, even if it ends up being imperfect. But that's something I would love to just talk to you about one-on-one, just to think through in terms of my own work. But the other part is just, how do you do, like, what can I get from Du Bois in terms of coming back to sociology and just being like, yo, I'm a sociologist, I do sociology, you just don't get it because of what I'm focused on, and the kinds of questions that I'm asking, but they're very much sociological questions.
Yeah, no, that's what we all face, and that's what I'm trying to tackle. I mean, there are, there's a book that came out very recently by Itzigson and Brown, the sociology of Du Boisian sociology, it's called. But it doesn't really engage sociology as we have known it. And I think we have to have this conversation with sociology as it exists. Some just want to throw the canon out. I'm not convinced that's going to work politically. So what I'm suggesting is, that these conversations will really, just as bringing Marx in the 1960s and 70s transformed our reading of Durkheim and Weber, so bringing Du Bois into sociology will actually transform our readings of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim in all sorts of new ways. But what specifically will Du Bois bring, in my view? Du Bois is distinctive in the experience-based theorizing. Everything starts with somebody's experience, very often his own. It is remarkable how he can build his theory out of his own experience. That is not an easy talent, but so that's one thing, is to have an experience, to recognize, and this is really important, to recognize that the theorist is part of the world they're theorizing. And that is not part of the old sociological tradition in which the sociologist is observing the world from outside. So that's the first point that is really significant. It really centers the theorist within his or her world. The other thing about Du Bois, I mean, Alden talks about scholar denied. Well, yes, he was scholar denied. He was discriminated against. He couldn't get any funds. Booker T. Washington was controlling all the funds. But you know what is interesting is that because he was forced out of academia, he became scholar emancipated, scholar liberated, because he did all the sorts of things that he did and wrote about because he had not found a place for himself within academia. It was a moment, these were as a life of, in a sense, of liberation. It freed him up to do things that we sociologists, as long as we stick in academia, find difficult to do. That made him, in my view, the greatest public sociologist that has ever lived on this planet, because he's brought his sociology into an engagement with the world beyond. So that public sociology is the second. I think the third is obviously that he looked at capitalism through the lens of race, which is what I call racial capitalism. It's a methodology. You look at capitalism through the lens of race. It's not a type of capitalism, it is a methodology. So that will be my third point. We have to look at racial capitalism in its historical context and comparative context. And the fourth is that, you know, he makes very clear that sociology, if we follow his trajectory, is a moral science. That is, it's based on a whole set of value commitments. I think that's true of Durkheim and Weber and Marx, and I think it's definitively true. And he's, you know, is very explicit about what is. He may change his mind, and as Dr. Gates will say, the very meaning of freedom will change over his life, but nevertheless, it's always a moral science. I think if we take sociology with those four precepts, we won't be seeing the same sociology that we have now.
Yeah, and you're
That's
just a footnote to your what you said is so true. Just remember, everyone, he had a deadline. He was the editor of a periodical between 1910 and 1934. And one of the reasons he wrote so much is that he had to write so much to keep his job, right? I mean, he loved writing, but he never would have written so much had he been a professor at Atlanta U. You're absolutely correct. It's a brilliant insight. But he was the editor of the biggest Black periodical in history to that time. And he was the journal. And he cranked it out, man. He didn't have writer's block. I'm gonna tell you about that.
Yeah, it's phenomenal how much he wrote.
Phenomenal. It's unbelievable.
And particularly when you start thinking about all the letters he wrote. Oh gosh. Anyway, so yeah. So anyway, those will be my four precepts that Du Bois brings, and I think it would explode sociology. Who knows whether sociology can absorb it, or whether it will try to domesticate Du Bois and reduce him to the Philadelphia Negro.
But it wasn't only Booker T. Washington who was jealous of Du Bois and denied him of funds. Everybody was jealous of Du Bois. He just had shifting enemies. You know, Alain Locke, Walter White. Oh my God, they despised each other. The money that had been promised for the Encyclopedia of the Negro, they gave to Gunnar Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma was funded with the money they had initially earmarked for Du Bois' Encyclopedia of the Negro, and then he had been undermined in that, you know, on that board. And that is why An American Dilemma, one of the million problems that I have with that. Anyway, I'll ask my final question after everyone else has spoken. So, Krishna, who's next?
Oh, Jim.
Thank you, Michael. That was really good. You know, it's really, really good to see people thinking about Du Bois after, you know, after 1920, let's say. I'm very heartened by that. I was just going to say, you know, just a couple things. One is, you know, well, sociology is not my field. I read it a little bit, but Marxism I know a little bit more about. And, you know, one way maybe of thinking about Du Bois and Marxism as well as Marx is to some degree to separate Du Bois, Marx for Du Bois from organized Marxism. I mean, not completely separate them, but in other words, you know, he is, as you guys point, as various people here, including you, have pointed out, I mean, Du Bois lived a very long time, and he was active intellectually, politically for an incredibly long time. So, you know, through a lot of different periods. I mean, obviously the world in 1896, especially for Black people, both in Africa and the diaspora, were, you know, was it was a completely different world than when he died in Ghana, right? I mean, it was just completely different. So he lived through a lot of different periods. So, you know, I think it's also helpful when you're thinking about Du Bois and Marxism to think about, okay, who is he interacting with? Also, what is he reading? What does it mean when he goes to, what is it, 26, 27, when he goes to the Soviet Union for the first time? Mm-hmm. That has a big impact on him. I mean, Kate Baldwin has written about that. You know, when race enters into US Marxism as a really major analytic with the whole idea of the Black Belt thesis and so forth in the late 20s, I think Black Reconstruction might, even though he had a very fraught relationship with the Communist Party at that time, I think that Black Reconstruction would have been very different if that wasn't out there in the world. I mean, I think it helped him think about the idea of, you know, this combination of nationalism and Marxism in a new kind of way that, you know, I mean, there have been people like the African Blood Brotherhood who've been doing some of that kind of stuff. So I think, you know, those currents are going around in the Harlem Renaissance. And then, you know, in the 30s, as you know, things change again, and then you get into the sort of post, you know, the end of colonialism. You know, I mean, I think that, you know, different kinds of Marxisms are circulating through different kinds of groups, you know, and as he meets people in 45, when he goes to Britain to go to the Pan-African Congress in Manchester, it's an important, you know, which is sort of this mixture of nationalists and Marxists. That's an important moment for him. He meets in London, he meets a youngish Black communist named Esther Cooper Jackson, who'd been a leader of the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And that's an important moment for him. Obviously, Shirley, as you mentioned, Shirley Graham, but even before meeting her, he's moving, you know, so you see, if you see what I'm saying is, so to think about, you know, so like, you know, the national question, this whole thing of the national question, sort of Marxist view of colonialism, things that, I mean, Marx wrote about colonies some, but things that Marx didn't really think about himself, but Marxists did. I think that might help you sort of sort out. The other thing I was going to say, I'm sorry, I mean, you can comment on that. I mean, I don't know if you know, it's not like Jeopardy. I didn't put it in the form of a question, but I think, you know, there is a question of thinking about, well, what when you think about Du Bois and Marxism, what is he, you know, what Marxism is he engaging with at a certain moment, you know, as far as that goes. The other thing is, though, thinking about him, the Marxist tradition is, you know, thinking about the question of Marx and the great man theory or the great figure theory. Like so many things with Du Bois, he's contradictory, right? Because Black Reconstruction really isn't a great man theory of revolution book. And ironically, you know, C.L.R. James, who acknowledges Black Reconstruction as an inspiration for Black Jacobins and a history of Negro revolt, but especially Black Jacobins. I mean, ironically, he's a Marxist who became famous later for jettisoning the idea of the vanguard party and that kind of centralist organization. But Black Jacobins, as James would admit later, is all about the great man theory, right? I mean, it's all about Toussaint Louverture. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, Du Bois, on one hand, could be seen as into a great man theory, but on the other hand, like you say, with Black Reconstruction, he's putting out the idea of a sort of grassroots revolution. So he provides both models. I mean, the last thing I'll say is thinking about Du Bois in Africa. I mean, I think again, it's important to pay attention, and I'm not saying you don't. You probably know all this stuff, but I'm just to put it out there, of, you know, the political arguments and debates that are going on in Africa at the time, right? In the sense that you have, you know, the competing visions of the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group, and Du Bois is, you know, more into the Casablanca, you know, and which is the more left trend, I guess you would say, in Africa, but, you know, are led by, and the more Pan-African trend, you know, is very much populated by these charismatic leaders like Sekou Touré and Nkrumah and Nasser. And I think there's a way in which he's invested in the leaders because they represent that kind of radical Pan-African vision that Du Bois, if this makes sense, Du Bois is relating to. So, I mean, I think that there's a sense in which he's seen Nkrumah or Ben Bella or Touré or Nasser as sort of embodying the nation. Now, that may be, we might look back and say that it's problematic, but I think it's a way of him pushing forward that Casablanca group vis-a-vis the Monrovia group, which he viewed, I think, as the more conservative and, you know, less, putting Africa in less of a position to be able to be a great power, I guess, which you could say, in the world, vis-a-vis the capitalist world, if that makes sense. So anyway, but I thought this was a great, really interesting. I'd love to talk more with you. You probably know a lot more about Stuart Hall than I do, actually, too, I have to say. Anyway.
Yeah. No, those are all totally appropriate comments. Yeah. I mean, when you put Du Bois in relationship to Marxism, what often happens is that people sort of solidify Marxism. Organized Marxism was the word you used, and they miss that the Marxist tradition is an incredibly dynamic, prolific, and diverse tradition. Yeah, it starts with Marx and Engels, but then we got German Marxism, which is a whole different kettle of fish from Russian Marxism, which is again a whole different kettle of fish from Western Marxism and from Third World Marxism. That itself is a dynamic thing. So often people try and say, "Ah, well, he wasn't a Marxist because he wasn't a Stalinist." And of course, some people say, of course, he was a Stalinist. But I think we have to recognize that the Marxist tradition is a very dynamic one. And it is interesting where he got his Marxism for Black Reconstruction. You might think, well, he's clearly himself saying he gets it from Capital, which is now teaching. He goes back to Atlanta University and starts teaching again. He starts teaching Capital. I think he's teaching German ideology from what I can see in the archives. But what he's not teaching, as far as I can tell, I'd love to be contradicted on this, the 18th Brumaire, which would be the obvious text from Marx that might inspire him to actually write the Black Reconstruction. But what I do know is that he has been reading Marx's own views of the Civil War. And of course, Marx's views of the Civil War, basically Marx says there has to be a movement from a constitutional war to a civil war, to a liberatory war. And so I think that's the sort of line that Du Bois takes in Black Reconstruction. So I think he is taking quite a lot from Marx as opposed to Marxists. He absorbs Marxists because he's surrounded by them. And so I mean, when he writes, I mean, it's fascinating that he writes The African Roots of War in 14 or 15. I mean, which is basically the story that Lenin tells 2 years later about the ways in which First World War is the result of European nations fighting for the control of Africa. I mean, it's extraordinary that he could have figured that before Lenin. But it's in the air. It's not as if Lenin invented it, tabula rasa. I mean, Luxemburg was talking about something similar too. So yeah, he is influenced by the company he keeps. So I think that is important to say. Yeah, yeah. What else? Yes. Oh yeah. Yeah. I just want to say, I just underline what you said, Jim. That yeah. There is a paradox between the Black Reconstruction analysis, and that's what we've been saying, and it's sort of Pan-Africanism. There is really something, they're very much at odds with one another. And let me say that Fanon, who's writing at the same time, I have seen no evidence that they ever met. I've looked in many places, but there's no evidence I can find. But Fanon recognizes that there are class divisions within the colonized. And where does he get that from? A lot of it comes from Maoism too. So it's not impossible for him to sort of jettison his Pan-Africanism in favor of a more class analysis, but he doesn't do it. And so I think perhaps Dr. Gates is right. The Pan-Africanism is so solidified in his habitus that he can't see beyond it when it comes to Africa. But it was a fascinating question. Yeah, very good. Sorry. Yeah, I should probably keep quiet. Yes, yes. Very good. Who's next?
David?
Yeah, David, yeah.
Okay. One of the, I suppose, concepts you didn't mention was eugenics, because looking at Du Bois in his early work, he's very plainly taking a eugenic view of not only the white society, but also Black society, and the talented 10th and the submerged 10th are very much eugenic concepts. But what's also odd, to me anyway, is that he keeps on talking in this way well into the 1920s, even in an editorial in Crisis. I think it's in 1926, he actually talks about the problem of the submerged tenth continuing to outbreed the talented tenth. So these ideas keep on going on. How do you reconcile eugenics with your picture of Du Bois, particularly in his earlier period?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that eugenics, I didn't know he was explicitly in favor of eugenics, but insofar as he was, it fits very nicely with my Durkheimian Du Bois, because Durkheim himself said that people are distinguished by their natural abilities. So it would fit very nicely with that vision of a Durkheimian Du Bois. But I would love you to tell me exactly where I should go for that, because that would be powerful ammunition in favor of this. And the question, of course, is when does he give this up?
Well, I'm not sure he does really, and certainly some of it lingers on to the 20s, and I think you'd have to get it from reading Galton, who invents eugenics, and of course it was very, very widespread indeed. But it tends
I know, but I'm wondering where in Du Bois does one go for his?
Well, he might have got it in Germany.
But
no, he's saying where in Du Bois's works.
When Du Bois works.
Send him the site of that editorial in 1926. Can you, David?
Yeah. Yes. It's his editorial. I think I can certainly give you the reference to that.
I don't know.
Du Bois never stopped being an elitist. I don't care what ideological coloring he put on his face that day. He was an elitist. He was the Negro. I'm telling you, man, that he was no egalitarian. You can forget that. He never criticized Stalin. I mean, that's part of that, I think. I don't want to get sidetracked here, but he wasn't as bad as Robeson. But there's a lot of gaps in his critique. But anyway, keep going. We're going to go to 2:00 today, without a doubt.
Okay, thanks very much, David. Is it Dwight next?
Yes.
Michael, not so much a question, but a couple of comments. First of all, thank you so much. This was so exciting. And to hear your passion, I just want to invite you to come to a Black barbershop with me, because you have the kind of energy that would thrive in a Black barbershop. You could take us to Durkheim and Marx and Weber, and we could all be in the Black barbershop. So thank you for that. That was powerful. But I have a different kind of comment, because as I told some of you, I'm working on a chamber opera on Du Bois, and it has little to do with Du Bois and his many scholastic lanes, but it has to do with the operatic sense of Du Bois, this bigger than life person who's very complicated. And as you've told me even more today, there's a Du Bois that I don't know. There's so many Du Boises. And so between you and Skip and all of the scholars, he becomes this really rich mystery, which I think has an operatic dimension, because as Skip describes him, Du Bois in Atlanta University, he and those spats were like legends well into the end of the 20th century. So I just wanted to thank you. And also to say, I can't wait to get up there so we can, over a couple of bottles of wine, talk about all of these Du Boises. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and yes, the Harlem Renaissance and Du Bois's relation to it is a total mystery to me. But it's a mystery. So that's, we'll have great discussions about that, I'm sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rita?
Thanks. I have, first of all, thank you, Michael, for giving me such a much more comprehensive view of Du Bois and for making it so clear. And your enthusiasm really carried the day. And I just feel like I learned a tremendous amount. I was intrigued by your mention of Du Bois's support of Israel, and Skip, your idea of the return to the promised land, and the idea of the support of the downtrodden, the survivors of the Holocaust, and so forth. But getting back to this idea of Marx and Du Bois, I wonder if it, and this is probably something everybody already knows, but I just wonder if the whole kibbutz movement, which is at its heart pure socialism, where everybody lives communally, everybody farms the land community, the wealth is communal, the schools are communal, the children are communal. I just wonder if that wasn't something that was appealing to Du Bois.
That's a very interesting question. I have no evidence that that is the case, but there would be a logical connection. One thing I didn't talk about was in 1934, he wrote this article, the Negro Nation Within a Nation. And it was the brief statement of a vision that he developed in the New Deal period of a African-American cooperative commonwealth. And basically he was saying, look, and in another unpublished book that Alain Locke turned down, a book that was called Negro and Social Reconstruction, he talks about how the New Deal was marginalizing African Americans systematically, and how integration was for now a dead end, and that we as African Americans must constitute ourselves as a solidary group, and it should have an economic basis, namely a cooperative basis. And he's very well known for that, and he writes at great length about it in Dusk of Dawn in 1940. And he's been accused, of going back to Booker T. Washington in being opposed, in not so endorsing integration. He was accused of being of following the Black Belt thesis. But the point is that he did have this vision that goes back actually in his writings. You can trace it even to in his first novel, the Quest of the Silver Fleece. His interest in the cooperative venture. And so he should be interested in the kibbutz movement. But I know of I've never seen any reference to that. So I will go in search for it. I should say, of course, that he changed his mind about Israel in 1956 with Suez, when he realizes that Israel is part and parcel of the imperial order. So I'm not totally convinced by Dr. Gates's view that this is a sort of return of a nativity. I mean, I think there's something weird about the way he sees the Jews as subjugated, and then realizes once they become part of a state apparatus, and Israel is actually struggling for its survival in the Middle East, and sides with the big powers, then he shifts his position. So yeah, but anyway, no, I think that's a very interesting idea, Rita. I will go and investigate that matter.
Thank you. Skip, did you have some questions?
Oh, yes. Everyone else asked?
Yes, so far, yes.
Oh, okay. Michael, I was going to draw attention to his analysis of World War I as well, and I'm so glad that you pointed that out. But you didn't get a chance to draw the connections between. You went from Du Bois to James, and James to Fanon, but not from Fanon to Stuart Hall, because you didn't have enough time. So I'm very interested in that. But I'm also interested in, I've just done a new edition of Black Reconstruction with Eric Foner for the Library of America, and it's being published in a week or so. And I'll be sure to give everyone a copy, all the fellows, because I don't have to pay for them, it'll be free, right? But it's an annotated edition. I'm interested in your critique of his argument. I mean, the use of the Black worker, the white worker. First of all, there's no question that we now know that maybe 500,000 in 1860, just to rehearse the facts, there were 3.9 million enslaved African Americans, according to the United States Federal Census. Because of the Emancipation Proclamation, 500,000, it's estimated now, got their freedom. Because as you recall, you could get your freedom if you made it behind Union lines. So as the Union Army advanced, the freedmen they were contraband of war. And many died from disease before they ever actually before the war ended, but that's a whole, in the contraband camps, which were attached to the Union forces. But the argument remains 500,000 people fled slavery, the plantation, as not literally all from plantations, that's a metaphor. And more and more historians have taken up that argument to talk about the Black agency in the Union victory. And when we remember, there were 200,000 Black men who fought in the US Army and Navy in the Civil War. Well, a large percentage of them were Black men who gained their freedom during the Civil War, because there were only 488,000 free Negroes in all of the United States in 1860. So you can't have 200,000 men as soldiers and all of them were free in 1860. Well over half were newly liberated enslaved men freed because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is something that's not often remarked upon. So Du Bois was right about that. But Michael, just in terms of your bullet point, where was he right and where was he wrong, in your opinion, using the worker framework, worker metaphor, however you want to put it?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, historically, of course, I don't know it. I mean, I'm really delighted to hear that you and Eric Foner are writing an annotated version and introducing it, because I've never been able to figure out exactly what Eric Foner's view is of Black Reconstruction. He fudges it too much. So perhaps he'll come clean. But I'm no historian at all. And this is all new to me. I used to study South African history, not US history. So that historically, I haven't got anything to say. And theoretically, I think it's just mind-blowing breakthrough, given what he's been writing until that point. So I'm left speechless by Black Reconstruction. I would have loved him to be a bit more upfront about those 4 chapters, the one on South Carolina, the one on Mississippi and Louisiana, the one on Alabama, Florida, and Georgia, and the one on the frontier states. I wish it could have been a bit more. I wish that the theoretical claims, the political claims, could be a bit clearer as to the as to how this interracial democracy was developing as a function of the different patterns of class and race. I find it quite difficult to figure out what he's saying in those 4 chapters. That's what I would love to have seen. But the opening, it's just amazing that he should be writing this. It boggles my mind. And because his PhD dissertation was a suppression of the slave trade, but there's no intimation of anything like this in that. Where does this come from? The guy, yeah, he's a great man. I mean, he's just a genius. I mean,
and when he wrote it, he was at a low point in his career. I mean, he had been fired for the first time from his position at the NAACP. He would be fired again.
Yeah.
45.
And that's right. He's doing this all now. Now you'll be able to correct me on this. Now I do believe that he had quite not an army, but quite a few research assistants.
Oh yeah,
that were working with him.
So that's in David Levering Lewis detailed. Sterling Brown was one. Sterling Brown, the great poet who went to Williams and then got a master's degree, as did County Cullen here at Harvard in the English department, and was a professor at Howard, was one of his main research assistants. Anyway, I don't want to. You and I will talk offline. But it was stunning.
Well, I'm glad you're going to give everybody a free copy. That's great. That's the biggest gift you can give everybody.
That's one thing I can promise. I can guarantee. Michael, this has been Christian. Are there any other raised hands?
No, I don't see any more.
Oh, well, Michael, let me thank you. It was just riveting. Each presentation has been riveting in its own way. And this did not disappoint in the least. Thank you so very much. And Dwight, I'm looking at Dwight in that head, and him talking about him taking you to the barbershop. Dwight, you need to get your behind to the barbershop.
This is the new me. This is the new me, man.
I love it. I love it. I love it. This is the old me.
I'm looking for the I'm looking forward to next semester when we can all be perhaps even touching one another.
Yeah.
I hope so. Let's pray. All right, you guys. Adios. See you soon.
Ciao.
Take care. Thank you. Bravo. Let's give it up to Michael for a great presentation.
Thank you,
David-
Michael. Thank you.
David, send that footnote. Send me a copy too. I want to read that.
Right, sure.
Okay. Cheers, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.